And a lot of early poetry was sung or recited in a, sort of with a beat. Not all of it was sung, but certainly all of it had some type of what we would say beat. And that's really how it developed until 100 and somewhat years ago that we started breaking away from that idea.
It's a cultural relationship between liturgy, song, poetry. One thing that's worth mentioning is that you'll hear about new formalism. Certainly if you're a poet, you've heard about it. And it was a movement in the 80s of 100% white men.
And some women.
Some women, but very few. It was not a very diverse group. Their approach was formal in that secondary sense. And it's now really kind of disparaged by formalists because they made all sorts of dictums beyond form about you can't write any sort of confessional poetry. It had to be. They made rules that just should not exist. But there's been sort of almost. They did a wonderful thing. They got formalism out of whatever cave they were holding a candle in, and they're still writing. And some of them are very good poets. But new formalism is passé. Formalism, I think, is melding very nicely into just poetry. John writes formal poems. John writes free verse. I do both. I mostly formal. I think there's not so much a camping anymore. I think it's rare to find a bigot, that will not write formal verse. I find there are more free verse bigots that won't touch formal verse than there are formal poets, or at least serious ones.
And I believe that, I don't know many of you in the audience, but when we talk about some of the formal poems, I think you already know some of these forms about which we're speaking. The sonnet, the haiku, although that's an Eastern form with very different rules from what we say would write here in the West. There's the sestina, there's the villanelle, there's terzarima, which is more of a pattern than a type of poem. That's what we're talking about. Usually meter, meaning that it has a beat, that there's a certain number of syllables or beats within a line before you break and go on to the next.
It's a measure.
It's a measure. Meter, yeah, it's a measure. And there have been some experimentation, of course, within the 20th century, still staying, like, for example, William Carlos Williams, who was a noted, writer of free verse. He really did begin as a formalist until he met Ezra Pound, who, corrected him in many ways. But he tried to come up with this idea of his own type of meter within what we would call free verse, and no one really takes it that seriously anymore. It's
are there any questions?
Yeah.
Jack?
Yeah, I'd like to, I'd like to both observe and question the influence of the social media in the 19th century and the rise of the novel in particular. That my sense is, and then go to Pound, my sense is that the forms that we have inherited were developed by writers of genius. And as the number of writers began to proliferate with the advent of large-scale publishing, there were more and more writers who lacked that particular attribute, though they continued to mine the forms, which produced a reaction to go away from that. And so, in fact, the form had become a form of imprisonment for thought, which I think is what Pound is wanting to break the pentameters through all that stuff. He wants it needs to be.
It's like everything else. It's like even the theory of evolution has to be challenged. It never comes up against a very good challenge of any kind. Everything has to be challenged. You know what I mean? And those challenges were good. Obviously, they produced great poetry.
And it is true that if one were to look at a newspaper on microfilm, or possibly digitized from the 19th century or really into the mid-20th century, you'll see a lot of what we would call amateur poetry, and so much of it will be in form, and it's not terribly good. It was called, occasional poetry. Someone had a visitor from Cleveland, to Oradell, New Jersey, and felt the need to memorialize this visit from this distinguished relative or friend by writing a poem to be sent to the local paper, or even the county paper or state paper, you know, to say, hey, you know, this is what happened. And they would choose a very formal method to do so.
Well, I mean, the word doggerel, I believe, just means bad poetry, and it's never applied to anything other than formal verse, right?
Now, I think that's it.
But I wonder whether
it's a short discussion. It's meant to pique your curiosity.
All right. We'll be around to talk afterward.
Yes.
I guess, that's what John said.
But I don't even know what the next thing is.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rick. Rick, write something on the wall.